The Élysée Palace meeting in May 2023 had been 6 months in the making. Emmanuel Macron, eager to reset French-African relations after years of deterioration, had invited several African leaders to Paris for what was billed as a reimagined partnership summit. Not the old Françafrique. Not paternalistic development aid, but a new relationship based on mutual respect and shared interests. The language was careful, the framing progressive, but everyone understood what was actually happening. France was trying to maintain influence in a region where its relevance was declining rapidly. Military bases closing, mining contracts being renegotiated. The CFA franc under challenge, French companies losing ground to Chinese, Turkish, and Russian competitors. Macron needed a narrative that acknowledged change while preserving French interests. The summit was that narrative. Young, progressive French president meeting with new generation of African leaders to forge authentic partnerships freed from colonial baggage. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had been invited somewhat reluctantly. His public criticisms of French policy were well known. His decision to demand French military withdrawal had been celebrated across Francophone Africa as long overdue assertion of sovereignty. But excluding him would look like France couldn't handle criticism. Including him created risk that he'd use the platform to challenge the entire premise of the summit. The French Foreign Ministry had conducted extensive pre-negotiations, clear understandings about what would be discussed. Parameters for disagreement. The expectation that even if Traoré was critical, he'd operate within diplomatic norms that prevented the summit from becoming a public embarrassment for Macron. They'd misunderstood who they were dealing with. When Traoré arrived at the Élysée Palace, the setting was designed to impress. Historic building, ornate rooms, everything communicating French power, culture, sophistication. The subtle message, this is who we are. This is why partnership with France matters. The opening plenary session featured Macron delivering what his speechwriters considered a masterful address. Acknowledging past mistakes. Praising African agency. Calling for a new chapter based on equality and mutual benefit. France recognizes that the relationship between our nation and Africa must evolve. The era of Françafrique is over. We stand ready to be partners, not patrons. To listen, not lecture. To engage on terms that respect African sovereignty and African priorities. But partnership is a two-way street. It requires trust, cooperation, and shared commitment to values we hold in common: democracy, human rights, sustainable development. France brings resources, expertise, and genuine desire to see Africa succeed. We ask only that our African partners bring the same commitment to working together toward common goals. It was greeted with polite applause. Several African leaders nodded approvingly. This was the language they'd wanted to hear for decades. Acknowledgement of equality. Respect for sovereignty. The end of paternalism. Then Macron made a mistake. We've prepared a framework document that outlines principles for renewed French-African partnership. It addresses security cooperation, economic development, educational exchanges, and democratic governance. We believe this framework, if adopted by participants, can guide our engagement going forward in ways that serve everyone's interests. He gestured to aides distributing copies of the document. I invite discussion and feedback. This is not a diktat. It's a starting point for conversation among equals. Traoré raised his hand immediately. The moderator, hoping to establish positive momentum first, tried to move to a more sympathetic African leader. Perhaps we could hear initial reactions from several participants before detailed discussion. I'd like to speak now. Traoré's tone was polite but firm. The moderator looked at Macron, who nodded. This was supposed to be open dialogue. Refusing to let Traoré speak would contradict the entire premise. Captain Traoré, please. Traoré stood. Several other African leaders looked uncomfortable. French officials tensed. President Macron, thank you for the invitation and for what I'm sure was a carefully prepared speech about the end of Françafrique and the beginning of equal partnership. I've been listening carefully. I've also been reading this framework document your staff prepared. And I have some observations. He held up the document. First, this document was prepared by French officials without input from African governments. It's being presented as a starting point for discussion, but it's actually a completed framework we're being asked to endorse. That's not discussion among equals. That's France setting terms and asking for African approval. Which is exactly how Françafrique worked. So we haven't actually moved past Françafrique. We've just changed the language we use to describe it. Several African leaders shifted uncomfortably. This was more direct than diplomatic protocol suggested. Second, this framework includes provisions about security cooperation that commit African nations to coordinating military operations with French forces. It describes this as mutual cooperation. But the practical effect is that African nations would be obligated to clear military decisions with France. That's not sovereignty. That's France maintaining veto power over African security policy while calling it partnership. Third, the economic development section emphasizes creating favorable investment climates for French companies. It talks about protecting existing French investments and ensuring stable regulatory environments. There's nothing about renegotiating unfavorable agreements or addressing the fact that French companies have been extracting African resources at rates that benefit France far more than African countries. So the economic partnership being proposed is, Africa continues current arrangements that serve French interests, and France calls it cooperation instead of exploitation. Macron's smile had frozen. This wasn't critical engagement within diplomatic parameters. This was systematic dismantling of the entire summit premise. Captain Traoré, I think you're mischaracterizing. I'm reading the text you provided. Section 3, Paragraph 2, participating nations agree to coordinate military operations that may affect regional stability with French defense officials. That's a commitment to clear military decisions with France. Section 5, Paragraph 4, regulatory frameworks should prioritize stability and predictability for existing investment partnerships. That's code for not renegotiating agreements that French companies don't want renegotiated. I'm not mischaracterizing. I'm reading what you wrote. Another African leader, the president of Senegal, tried to smooth things over. Perhaps the language could be refined to better reflect mutual commitments. It's not the language. It's the substance. France wants African nations to commit to security coordination, stable regulations that protect French investments, and democratic governance that France gets to assess. In exchange, France offers to maintain current levels of development assistance and continue military cooperation. That's not a new partnership. That's the old relationship with better marketing. Macron leaned forward, his characteristic cool showing signs of strain. Captain Traoré, what exactly are you proposing? That we have no framework at all? That each bilateral relationship proceeds without any common principles? That seems less productive than trying to establish shared values and mutual obligations. What I'm proposing, President Macron, is that if you want a new partnership, France needs to come with a fundamentally different approach. Not a document prepared in Paris telling African nations what the terms of partnership will be. Not commitments that bind African sovereignty to French approval. Not economic frameworks designed to preserve French corporate advantages. An actual new approach. Which would look like what specifically? It would start with France accepting that African nations will make security decisions based on our own assessment of our security needs. If those decisions include asking French forces to leave, France accepts that without retaliation. If those decisions include diversifying security partnerships to include Russia, China, or Turkey, France doesn't treat that as betrayal. That's what sovereignty actually means. On economics, it would mean France supporting African nations as we renegotiate mining and resource contracts to terms that better serve our development. Not defending French corporate interests. Not pressuring African governments to maintain unfavorable agreements. Actually supporting African economic sovereignty even when it costs French companies profit. And on development assistance, it would mean France providing support without political conditions. Without requiring that African nations align with French foreign policy positions. Without leveraging aid to maintain influence. That's what partnership between equals would actually look like. What you're proposing is inequality with partnership vocabulary. The room was silent. Other African leaders were processing. Some looked like they wanted to applaud but couldn't in this setting. Others looked concerned about French reaction to such direct challenge. French officials looked stunned. This was supposed to be a diplomatic summit, not a public evisceration of French policy. Macron recovered with visible effort. Captain Traoré, I appreciate directness. But I have to say, what you're describing isn't partnership. It's Africa doing whatever it wants while France provides resources without any expectation of shared values or coordinated approaches. That's not sustainable. France has legitimate interests. French companies have made significant investments based on agreed terms. French military presence has provided security. We're not seeking to dominate. We're seeking mutually beneficial cooperation. But cooperation requires some level of coordination and shared commitment. You seem to be rejecting any framework that includes French interests at all. President Macron, I'm rejecting frameworks where French interests are protected through African subordination. Your document protects French corporate investments by requiring stable regulatory environments, which means African nations can't change on favorable terms. It protects French security interests by requiring coordination, which means African nations can't make independent military decisions. It protects French influence by conditioning assistance on governance standards that France assesses. Every protection of French interests in this document comes through limitations on African sovereignty. That's not mutual cooperation. That's France protecting its interests at Africa's expense while calling it partnership. Another African leader, trying to find middle ground, suggested, perhaps we could revise the framework to make commitments more clearly reciprocal. The problem isn't making French limitations on African sovereignty sound more reciprocal. The problem is accepting French limitations on African sovereignty at all. France doesn't get to set terms for African security policy. Doesn't get to protect French corporate investments from renegotiation. Doesn't get to condition assistance on African foreign policy alignment. If France can't engage without those things, then France isn't ready for the partnership it claims to want. It's just rebranding Françafrique. The session broke for lunch with no framework adopted and considerable tension. Macron had intended to secure endorsements from multiple African leaders, creating momentum for his reimagined partnership narrative. Instead, he'd been publicly challenged on whether anything had actually changed. During lunch, several French officials approached Traoré privately. The message was consistent, his approach was unnecessarily confrontational. There was room for negotiation within the framework. By rejecting it entirely, he was isolating himself and potentially damaging Burkina Faso's relationship with France. Traoré's response was the same to each: I'm not here to negotiate terms of subordination. I'm here because you invited me to a partnership summit. If it's actually a summit where France sets terms and African nations are expected to accept them, then you misrepresented the event. If it's actually a partnership summit, then my feedback about why your proposed framework isn't partnership should be welcome.
The afternoon session resumed with palpable tension. Macron had spent lunch being advised by his team to salvage something from the summit. The strategy: acknowledge some of Traoré's points while defending the framework's core elements, then move forward with leaders willing to engage constructively. But Macron's pride had been wounded. He was the young, progressive French president who'd promised to end Françafrique. He'd crafted careful language about equality and mutual respect. And an African military captain had called it rebranded colonialism in front of other African leaders and international press. He opened the afternoon by addressing Traoré directly. Captain Traoré, this morning you offered sharp criticism of France's proposed framework. I want to address your concerns seriously because I believe they reflect misunderstandings that, if clarified, might allow for productive engagement. It was diplomatic language for, let me explain why you're wrong. You suggested that security coordination means France maintaining veto power over African military decisions. That's not accurate. What we're proposing is information sharing and consultation when operations might affect regional stability. That's standard practice among allies. NATO members coordinate. EU members coordinate. This isn't about French control. It's about avoiding situations where uncoordinated actions create security problems that affect everyone. On economic issues, you characterized protecting existing investments as France preventing African nations from renegotiating contracts. But there's a principle in international law about honoring agreements. When companies invest billions based on agreed terms, unilaterally changing those terms creates uncertainty that affects all future investment. We're not asking African nations to accept unfair arrangements. We're asking for changes to be negotiated rather than imposed. That's not unreasonable. And on development assistance, you seem to suggest France should provide support with no conditions whatsoever. But all development assistance comes with some expectations. When European Union provides assistance, it expects certain governance standards. When World Bank provides loans, it expects fiscal responsibility. France isn't unique in having expectations tied to assistance. We're just being transparent about what they are. Traoré had been taking notes. When Macron finished, he stood again. President Macron, thank you for the clarifications. Let me respond to each point. On security coordination, you compared it to NATO. But NATO members are equals with mutual defense obligations. What you're proposing is that African nations clear military decisions with France, but France has no obligation to clear its decisions with African nations. When France intervened in Mali, did it consult with Burkinabe government first? When France operates Barkhane bases across the Sahel, are those operations coordinated with host nations, or are host nations informed after decisions are made? The coordination you're describing is one-directional. African nations coordinating with France. That's not alliance. That's supervision. On honoring agreements, you're right that international law includes principles about contract sanctity. It also includes principles about contracts signed under duress or without informed consent. When Burkina Faso negotiated mining contracts while completely dependent on French aid and security support, were those agreements negotiated between equals? Or were they signed by governments that had no leverage to demand better terms? Because if they were signed under dependency, renegotiating them once we have some sovereignty isn't breach of contract. It's correction of imbalanced agreements. And France defending those agreements isn't about rule of law. It's about protecting French corporate profits. On development assistance conditions, you're correct that all donors have expectations. The question is what those expectations serve. EU conditions on governance aim to improve governance. World Bank conditions on fiscal policy aim to ensure loan repayment. What do French conditions serve? When France conditions assistance on African nations not diversifying security partnerships, that serves French strategic interests, not African development. When France expects African nations to support French foreign policy positions, that serves French diplomacy, not African interests. So French conditions aren't about ensuring good governance or responsible use of funds. They're about maintaining French influence. And that's the difference. Macron's composure was slipping. You seem to believe France has no legitimate interests that should be considered in partnership. France has interests. The question is whether African nations are obligated to subordinate our interests to French interests. That's what your framework requires. African security decisions subordinated to French approval. African economic policy subordinated to protecting French investments. African foreign policy subordinated to maintaining French partnerships. You're calling it mutual cooperation, but everything flows one direction. Macron stood now, abandoning the relaxed posture he'd maintained earlier. Let me be very direct, Captain Traoré. You speak as if France has only extracted from Africa. As if we've provided nothing. France provides significant development assistance. Military support that has prevented terrorist takeovers. Educational opportunities. Infrastructure investment. These aren't trivial contributions. And yes, we expect partners who benefit from French support to consider French interests. That's not imperialism. That's basic reciprocity. And this is where Traoré delivered the response that would define the summit. President Macron, let me be equally direct. France provides approximately €3 billion annually in aid to all Francophone African nations. French companies extract approximately €50 billion annually in resources and profits from those same nations. The net flow is from Africa to France by a factor of 15 to 1. You're not helping us. You're extracting from us and returning a small fraction while calling it generosity. And then expecting gratitude and political alignment in exchange for that fraction. On military support, French military intervention in the Sahel has coincided with dramatic deterioration of security. When France established permanent bases in 2013, terrorism in the region was limited. Today it's widespread. So French military presence hasn't prevented terrorist expansion. It's presided over it. Maybe because French military strategy serves French interests, protecting uranium mines in Niger, maintaining bases that project French power, rather than actually defeating insurgencies. On educational opportunities, France offers scholarships to African students who are educated in French systems, in French language, learning French perspectives. Then many of those students stay in France because opportunities in African countries have been limited by economic systems that serve French extraction. That's not educational generosity. That's brain drain facilitated by France while you take credit for the scholarships. So when you say France expects reciprocity for its contributions, what I hear is, France expects political alignment in exchange for returning a fraction of what it extracts. That's not reciprocity. That's a protection racket. And we're tired of it. The room was absolutely silent. Several African leaders looked shocked at the directness. Others were nodding slightly, agreeing but unable to say so publicly. French officials looked furious. Macron's face was flushed. Those numbers are they're from economic analyses by French researchers. African resource extraction studies. Trade balance data. I didn't make them up. You can dispute the exact figures, but the directional flow is undeniable. More leaves Africa for France than France provides to Africa. That's been true for a century. It's true today. And your framework does nothing to change it. It preserves the arrangements that make it true while asking African nations to be grateful for the partnership. The president of Ivory Coast, trying desperately to prevent complete breakdown, intervened. Perhaps we could take a brief recess to allow for private discussions about modifications to the framework. I don't need private discussions. Traoré's voice was calm but firm. I need to be clear for everyone in this room and everyone watching. Burkina Faso will not sign a framework that requires us to coordinate security decisions with France. Will not commit to protecting French investments from renegotiation. Will not accept political conditions on assistance. If that means Burkina Faso doesn't participate in this partnership, we accept that. Because this isn't partnership. It's Françafrique with better vocabulary. And we're done with it. Macron tried once more. Captain Traoré, you're isolating yourself. Other African leaders understand the value of French partnership even if terms need refinement. By taking this extreme position, you harm only Burkina Faso. Other African leaders can speak for themselves. But I notice that none of them have defended your framework. They've tried to broker compromise, which suggests they also have concerns but are too diplomatic to state them as directly as I have. So maybe I'm not isolated. Maybe I'm just willing to say what others are thinking. He looked around the room at other African leaders. And President Macron is right that Burkina Faso might face consequences for rejecting French terms. France might reduce assistance. Pressure international institutions we engage with. Support opposition groups. These are tools France has used before when African leaders challenged French interests. But here's what's different now, we're not alone. Several African nations are rethinking French relationships. CFA franc is under challenge. Military bases are closing. Alternative partners are available. So French leverage isn't what it used to be. And maybe that's why this summit is really happening. Not because France suddenly believes in equal partnership, but because French influence is declining and you need a narrative that makes the decline look like strategic choice rather than forced retreat. Macron had had enough. This summit was convened in good faith to establish new terms for engagement. You've turned it into a platform for anti-French rhetoric that doesn't serve anyone's interests. If Burkina Faso doesn't want French partnership, that's your choice. But don't presume to speak for other African nations who understand the value of what we're offering. I'm not speaking for anyone. I'm speaking about the framework you prepared. If other nations want to sign it, that's their decision. I'm explaining why Burkina Faso won't. And I'm pointing out that the framework preserves French interests through African subordination while calling it partnership. Other leaders can assess whether that's accurate. But I won't pretend it's something it isn't just to maintain diplomatic courtesy. The summit effectively ended there. Macron delivered closing remarks about the importance of dialogue even when views diverge. Several African leaders made diplomatic statements about continuing discussions. But no framework was adopted. No joint declaration issued. The summit that was supposed to demonstrate renewed French-African partnership instead demonstrated exactly why that partnership was failing. Within hours, video of Traoré's interventions was circulating across Francophone Africa. Traoré confronts Macron: you extract 50 billion, return 3 billion, and call it partnership. Burkina Faso leader rejects French framework: this isn't partnership, it's Françafrique with better vocabulary. African captain tears up Macron's terms at Élysée summit. French media tried to frame it as one radical leader disrupting productive discussions. But African media celebrated it as long overdue confrontation of French hypocrisy. Progressive French analysts acknowledged that Traoré had identified real problems with the framework that other African leaders had been too polite to articulate so directly. 3 weeks after the summit, Macron gave an interview addressing the failure. We tried to establish a new framework for French-African relations. Unfortunately, some participants weren't interested in constructive engagement. They preferred rhetorical attacks to genuine dialogue. That's disappointing, but we'll continue working with African partners who are serious about cooperation. But privately, according to sources close to the Élysée, Macron was frustrated that Traoré had so effectively dismantled the summit's premise. The young African military captain had done in 2 interventions what years of activist criticism hadn't accomplished. Forced admission that French partnership frameworks were designed to preserve French interests through African subordination. 6 months later, France announced a strategic review of its African engagement. Military bases would be reduced. Development assistance would be restructured. The CFA franc would be reformed. Each change was presented as French strategic choice. But everyone understood the reality. France was being forced to change because African nations were rejecting old terms and France lacked the leverage to impose them. When asked about the Élysée summit a year later, Traoré said, Macron tried to set terms for renewed French-African partnership. He prepared a framework in Paris. Invited African leaders to endorse it. Called it dialogue among equals. But equals don't have one side prepare terms for the other to accept. That's not dialogue. That's France setting conditions and expecting African compliance. I tore up those terms because they needed to be torn up. They preserved French interests through African subordination while using partnership language. Other African leaders knew it. But someone needed to say it directly. So I did. Did it damage Burkina Faso's relationship with France? Yes. France reduced assistance. Pressured our international partners. Made clear there would be consequences for rejecting French frameworks. But those consequences were worth paying. Because accepting the framework would have locked us into commitments that served France more than Burkina Faso. And the message needed to be sent: African nations won't accept French-designed frameworks for African policy anymore. If France wants partnership, it needs to come with actual partnership terms. Not Françafrique rebranded. The old relationship is over. Whether France accepts that or not.